Montana Territory, autumn 1888. Raymond Kephart was 41 years old, a former track layer and warehouse foreman who'd spent 5 years with the Northern Pacific Railroad watching crews bolt together curved metal shells called Quonset huts. They went up fast, shed snow, and turned wind like water off a rock. Raymond couldn't stop thinking about that last part. That September, while his neighbors were chinkling their log cabins and stacking cord after cord of firewood, Raymond started hauling sheets of corrugated metal from the rail yard in Livingston. He paid $8 for enough scrap roofing to cover his entire cabin. Walls, roof, everything. The question wasn't whether it looked ridiculous. Everyone agreed it did. The problem wasn't the cabin. Raymond's place was solid, chinked tight, good corner notching, a fieldstone chimney that drew clean. The problem was the wind. Valley wind came down off the Absaroka Range at 30-40 miles per hour for days at a time. And it didn't matter how tight your chinking was. That wind found every seam, every gap, every place where two logs met. It pulled heat straight through the wood. Raymond had a wife, Catherine, 38, and 2 children, Margaret, 14, and Samuel, 11. They'd been in the valley 6 years. The winter of 1886 had nearly killed them. Burned 4 cords of wood by February, and still woke to ice on the inside walls. Raymond wasn't doing that again. Jonas Millwright was the valley's master builder, 62 years old, built half the cabins within 20 miles. He stopped by in October and stood looking at Raymond's work for a long minute. "You're wasting your time, Kephart," Jonas said. "Moisture's gonna trap between that metal and your logs. Rot'll set in by spring, and that metal's gonna make the place colder, not warmer. Metal conducts heat straight out." Raymond kept nailing. "Metal's not touching the logs," he said. "Left a 4-inch gap all the way around." Jonas shook his head. 4 inches of what? Empty air? That won't do a damn thing." Raymond had learned something on the railroad that Jonas hadn't. Metal doesn't need to insulate. Metal just needs to stop wind. And still air that can't move, that's what holds heat. 4 inches of trapped air between metal and logs was worth more than 2 feet of solid wood, because wind couldn't get through metal and couldn't push the trapped air around. But trying to explain that to Jonas was like explaining why water runs downhill. Some things you just had to see work. The talking started at the trading post. By November, half the valley had heard about Kephart's tin coffin. At Sunday church, Emma Driggs asked Catherine if Raymond had hit his head. Thomas Walcott, who owned the sawmill, said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "Man covers a good cabin with scrap metal. He's either crazy or he don't know the first thing about staying warm." Catherine didn't say much about it at first. She trusted Raymond. He'd kept them alive this long. But she couldn't deny the cabin looked wrong. Looked like a grain shed. Looked temporary. And when the first snow came in mid-November and the temperature dropped, she felt the same cold draft along the floor she'd always felt. Metal didn't seem to be making any difference. Raymond told her to wait. "It's not cold yet," he said. "Real test comes in January." By December, the valley had settled into the usual winter rhythm. Fires going all day, all night. Wood piles shrinking. Families waking in the dark to rekindle stoves that had burned low. Inside temperatures hovering in the 40s and 50s, unless you stood right next to the fire. Everyone wore coats indoors. Everyone slept under 3 or 4 blankets. That was just winter. Raymond's cabin felt different by mid-December, though Catherine couldn't quite explain how. The draft along the floor was gone. The cold spots near the walls, the places where you never wanted to sit, those were warmer. The whole space felt more even. And Raymond wasn't burning wood the way he used to. He let the fire drop low at night, down to coals, and the cabin still felt livable in the morning. Jonas came by again 2 days before Christmas. Stood outside, looking at the metal shell, shook his head. "You got lucky so far," he said. "But it ain't been cold yet. Wait till January. That metal's gonna pull every bit of warmth out of your place." Then January showed up. The cold front hit on January 7th. Temperature dropped to 12 below zero overnight, and the wind came with it. Sustained gusts at 40 miles per hour straight out of the north. By the second day, it was 18 below, with no sign of letting up. By the third day, the valley was burning wood faster than they could split it. The Hendricks family, a quarter-mile south, ran out of kindling by day 4 and started breaking up chairs. The Mercers, just over the ridge, had their chimney crack from the temperature shock and had to move the whole family into one room with a small heating stove. Catherine's sister, living 3 miles west, sent her eldest son on horseback to ask if they could borrow firewood. They were down to their last half-cord, and it was only mid-January. Inside Raymond's cabin, the temperature held at 67 degrees. The fire in the stove burned steady but not hot, just enough to take the chill off. Raymond fed it twice a day, morning and evening, with half the wood he used to burn. The walls felt neutral to the touch. No cold spots. No drafts. The floor stayed warm enough to walk on in stocking feet. Catherine couldn't make sense of it. She'd lived through 6 Montana winters, and she'd never felt a cabin hold warmth like this. It wasn't stuffy. It wasn't overheated. It just stayed even, stable, livable, while the wind outside tried to peel the roof off every other structure in the valley. By day 6, word started spreading. People noticed Raymond's chimney wasn't pouring smoke the way everyone else's was. Noticed he wasn't outside splitting wood 3 times a day. Thomas Walcott rode past on the 8th day and stopped, staring at the cabin. Smoke was coming out of the chimney, but barely. Thin, lazy column. Like the fire inside was just ticking over. Jonas Millwright came by on the 9th day. Didn't say anything at first. Just stood in the yard, mittens pulled off, flexing his hands in the cold. Wind was still blowing at 25 miles per hour. Temperature was 9 below. "You burning green wood?" Jonas asked. Raymond looked up from the wood he was splitting. "Same wood as everyone else. Your chimney's barely smoking. Don't need much fire." Jonas squinted at the metal-covered cabin. "How warm is it in there?" "Warm enough," Raymond said. "Want to see?" Jonas followed him inside. The warmth hit him immediately. Not a blast of heat, but a steady, even warmth that filled the whole space. No cold draft when the door opened. No icy spots near the walls. Just consistent, livable warmth. The stove was burning low, coals glowing, but no big flames. Jonas pulled off his coat, stood there in his wool shirt, looking around. Walked to the far corner of the cabin, the corner that should have been the coldest spot in any structure. Put his hand on the log wall. It was cool, but not cold, not freezing, not pulling heat out of the room. He looked at Raymond. "What's the temperature in here?" "Haven't measured exact," Raymond said, "but it's been above 60 all week." Jonas walked back to the door, opened it, stepped outside into the wind. 9 below, gusts that cut through wool like it wasn't there. He stepped back inside, closed the door. The wind noise stopped. The cold stopped. It was like stepping into a different season. "How?" Jonas said. Raymond pointed at the walls. "Wind can't get through metal. Hits the outside, moves around it, keeps going. Doesn't push through the gaps in the logs because it never reaches the logs. And the air between the metal and the wood, that air can't move. Wind can't push it, can't replace it with cold air, so it just sits there, holding whatever temperature the cabin is. Acts like a blanket." Jonas stared at the wall for a long minute. 4 inches of still air. That's it. And the metal doesn't freeze the place. "Metal's on the outside," Raymond said. "Cold metal, but it's not touching anything warm. Air gap keeps the metal and the logs separate. Logs stay at room temperature. Metal does its job blocking wind." Jonas looked at the stove, then back at Raymond. "How much wood you burning?" 2 armloads a day. Sometimes 3 if it drops below 20 below. Jonas shook his head slowly. "I'm burning 6, 7 armloads. Keeping my place at 50 degrees if I'm lucky." The cold snap lasted 11 days. By the time it broke on January 18th, most families in the valley had burned through half their winter wood supply. 3 families had to borrow from neighbors. 1 family moved in with relatives because their cabin couldn't hold heat, and they couldn't afford more firewood. Raymond's cabin used 1.5 cords total. At that rate, he'd finish winter with wood left over. Jonas told 4 families about the metal shell before the month ended. 2 of them asked Raymond if they could see it. Raymond walked them through the same demonstration. Door open, step outside into the wind. Door closed. Wind stops, warmth holds. Both families asked where he got the metal. By February, Thomas Walcott stopped making jokes. His sawmill had sold more corrugated roofing metal in 6 weeks than it usually sold in a year. Families were covering cabins, sheds, small outbuildings. Anything they needed to keep warm. Some people nailed metal directly over logs with no gap. Those setups worked, but not as well. The ones who left the airspace, the ones who understood what Raymond understood, those cabins stayed warmest. The Mercers built a metal shell over their cracked chimney cabin and moved back into the main room. The Koenigs, who'd been burning furniture, covered their place in March and cut their wood use in half. By April, 11 families in the valley had metal shell cabins. By the following autumn, that number was up to 23. Jonas built one for himself that summer. Took him 4 days. He used 6-inch gaps instead of 4-inch, thinking more air would insulate better. It didn't. 6 inches allowed convection currents to form, moving warm air up and cold air down, which reduced the insulating effect. He rebuilt it with 4-inch gaps and it worked perfectly. He admitted to Raymond that he'd been wrong. Said it wasn't easy to say, but facts were facts. The metal shell worked. And it worked because Raymond understood wind. Subscribe if you want to see more forgotten innovations that worked when nothing else would. The technique spread beyond the valley by 1890. Families moving into the territory heard about the metal shells and built them from the start. Some used curved panels, trying to mimic the Quonset hut shape Raymond had seen on the railroad. Others used flat panels, which worked just as well as long as the air gap was maintained. A few tried double metal layers with 2 air gaps, but that added weight and cost without adding much warmth. The single-layer shell with 4 to 6 inches of trapped air became the standard. Raymond never charged anyone for the idea, showed anyone who asked how to do it right, explained the physics as plainly as he could. Wind is the enemy. Metal stops wind. Still air holds heat. Keep those 3 things in your head, and you won't freeze. By the mid-1890s, the railroad started selling scrap corrugated metal specifically for cabin shells. They'd seen the demand. Families buying it by the wagon load. The Northern Pacific built a small warehouse in Livingston just to store surplus roofing metal. And it moved faster than new lumber some months. The innovation worked because it was simple. No special tools, no rare materials, just metal, nails, and an understanding that wind steals heat faster than cold air does. A cabin at 40 degrees in still air feels livable. A cabin at 40 degrees in a 30-mile-per-hour wind feels like it's trying to kill you. The metal stopped the wind. That was the whole trick. Raymond Kephart lived in that cabin until 1903. The metal shell never rusted through, never leaked, never caused moisture problems with the logs. When he and Catherine moved to Bozeman to be closer to their daughter, the new family who bought the cabin kept the metal on, kept it warm through 15 more winters. Jonas Millwright told the story until he died in 1908. Told it to apprentices, told it to skeptics, told it to anyone who thought they knew everything about building in cold country. "I was wrong about Kephart," he'd say. "Dead wrong, and I'm glad he proved it, because that metal shell saved more families than I can count." The technique faded by the 1920s as better insulation materials became available, and as families moved into town where central heating made cabin tricks unnecessary. Some of the old metal shells stayed up into the 30s and 40s, more as relics than as functional structures. A few are probably still out there, rusting quietly in Montana valleys, covering log cabins that no one lives in anymore. But for 2 decades, from 1888 to about 1910, the metal shell cabin was the warmest, most fuel-efficient structure you could build in cold country. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't traditional. It looked wrong to anyone who didn't understand wind. But it worked. And it worked because one man paid attention to what he'd learned building railroad warehouses and refused to freeze just because everyone else thought he was crazy. The physics haven't changed. Wind still steals heat. Still air still insulates. Metal still blocks wind. The principle is as true now as it was in 1888. What changed was that we built tighter houses, used factory-made insulation, and stopped needing to think about the gap between blocking wind and blocking cold. Raymond understood the difference. That's what kept his family warm. If you're thinking about building anything in cold country today, talk to a licensed engineer. Modern building codes exist for good reasons: fire safety, structural integrity, moisture control. The metal shell worked in 1888 because it solved the specific problem of wind-driven heat loss in a log cabin. Your situation is different, your climate is different, your materials are different. Don't build anything without professional guidance. But the story matters because it shows what's possible when you stop assuming the old ways are the only ways. Raymond wasn't smarter than Jonas Millwright. Jonas had forgotten more about building than Raymond ever knew. But Raymond had seen something Jonas hadn't. Those Quonset huts going up along the rail line, shedding wind, staying dry. And he asked himself if that principle could keep a family warm. It could. It did. And for 20 years, it kept dozens of families from freezing, while their neighbors burned through wood like it was free. Comment where you're watching from, and whether you've ever seen a building technique that looked wrong, but worked anyway. The metal shell over the log cabin. The innovation everyone called a tin coffin. The trick that saved a valley. Because sometimes, the ugliest solution is the warmest one. Raymond Kephart died in 1927 at the age of 80. He's buried in Sunset Hills Cemetery in Bozeman. His cabin stood until the mid-1950s, when the new owners tore down the metal shell to salvage the corrugated panels for a machine shed. The logs underneath were still solid. No rot. No moisture damage. Just old wood that had been protected from wind for 70 years. Jonas Millwright's cabin, the one he covered with metal in 1889, lasted even longer. It stood until 1962, still tight, still warm, still proving that wind is the enemy and metal stops wind. The principle works because physics works. You can't argue with thermodynamics. You can't negotiate with wind. You can build tight, you can burn hot, you can wear every coat you own. But if wind is pulling heat out of your walls faster than your stove can replace it, you're going to freeze. The metal shell stopped the wind. The air gap held the heat. The cabin stayed warm. That's not luck. That's understanding what the problem actually is. Modern builders know this now. They call it a rain screen, a ventilated facade, a pressure-equalized wall system. They use different materials: house wrap, rigid foam, engineered panels, but the principle is identical. Create a wind barrier on the outside. Leave an air gap. Let the structure underneath stay at a stable temperature. Raymond Kephart figured that out in 1888 with scrap railroad metal and a hammer. If you talk to old-timers in Montana, some of them still remember the metal cabins. They'll tell you their grandparents lived in one, or they'll point to a hillside where one used to stand. They'll say it looked like hell, but it worked. They'll say their grandmother swore by it, said it was the warmest place she ever lived. Some of them will even say they wish someone still built that way. Because propane heat is expensive, and a wood stove only warms the room it's in. And there was something about those old metal shells that just held warmth better than anything built since. They're not wrong. The metal shell worked. It worked because it solved the actual problem, not the problem people thought they had. The valley where Raymond built his cabin is still there. Most of the old cabins are gone, replaced by ranch houses and manufactured homes. But if you hike the back ridges, you'll find foundations, old chimney stones, pieces of rusted corrugated metal half buried in the dirt. That's what's left of the warmest cabins in Montana Territory. The ones everyone laughed at. The ones that worked. That's the lesson, if there is one. The solution that looks wrong isn't always wrong. The idea that sounds crazy isn't always crazy. Sometimes the ugliest answer is the right answer, and the only way to know for sure is to build it and let winter test it. Raymond built it. Winter tested it. It worked. Cinematic historical documentary photography. Present-day Montana Valley landscape, showing rolling hills and distant mountains. A few old weathered metal pieces. The story is complete. I've generated 21.2 minutes of content, with a natural ending at the end. However, since you've indicated the target is 35 minutes and we're at 60.7%, I should continue with additional legacy content to reach the full length. I'll extend the historical aftermath and broaden the impact story while maintaining the documentary tone. The metal shell technique didn't stay confined to one Montana valley. By 1892, variations of Raymond's design were showing up across the northern territories, Wyoming, the Dakotas, even northern Idaho, where winters came early and stayed late. The railroad workers spread it. They'd seen the Livingston cabins, understood the principle, and carried the knowledge with them as they moved from job to job, camp to camp, settlement to settlement. In the Bighorn Basin of Wyoming, a crew foreman named Dutch Kellerman built a metal shell over the railroad bunkhouse in the winter of 1893. Used flat panels instead of curved, left a 5-inch gap, sealed the bottom edge to prevent air circulation. That bunkhouse stayed 15 degrees warmer than the mess hall next door, and the company saved 2 cords of coal per month. By spring, Dutch had built metal shells over 4 more camp buildings. The railroad took notice. The Northern Pacific issued an internal memo in 1894 recommending metal shell construction for all new winterline camps above 4,000 feet elevation. Not a requirement, just a recommendation. But superintendents read that memo, did the math on fuel costs, and started ordering metal. By 1896, most high-altitude section houses between Minnesota and Washington had some version of the metal shell. Some used corrugated panels. Some used flat sheets. All of them left an air gap. All of them burned less fuel. The mining camps picked it up next. Silver Creek, Montana, a copper camp 12 miles north of Butte, had 63 cabins by 1895, and 19 of them had metal shells. The mine superintendent, a man named Carlson, who'd worked railroad construction before switching to mining, saw the fuel savings and made it camp policy. Any new structure built after January 1896 had to include either a metal shell or equivalent wind barrier. Carlson didn't care what it looked like. He cared that his men stayed warm enough to work. One miner, a Cornish immigrant named Trelawney, built a hybrid design that winter. Log cabin base, metal shell over the logs, then a second inner wall of canvas stretched on a wood frame, creating 2 air gaps instead of 1. The canvas inner wall could be taken down in summer for ventilation and put back up in October. That cabin stayed at 72 degrees through a January cold snap that hit 38 below. Trelawney used 3/4 of a cord per month. His neighbor in a standard log cabin used 4 cords. Other miners asked Trelawney how he'd done it. He walked them through the design, explained the 2-gap system, stressed that the canvas had to be tight and sealed at the bottom, or convection would kill the insulation effect. By the following winter, 8 cabins in Silver Creek had the double-gap design. By 1898, that number was 21. The technique evolved as it spread. In northern Minnesota, where winters were brutal, but wind was less constant than in Montana, builders used the metal shell concept, but substituted tar paper or heavy canvas for the metal. Lighter, cheaper, easier to handle. The insulation effect wasn't quite as good. Canvas moved in the wind where metal didn't, but it still cut fuel use by 40 to 50% compared to a bare log cabin. In the Dakota territories, where timber was scarce and sod construction was more common than log, Homesteaders built metal shells over sod walls. The combination was incredibly effective. Sod provided thermal mass. It absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. The metal shell stopped wind from pulling that stored heat away. Cabins built with both techniques stayed warm for hours after the fire went out, sometimes until morning. A Norwegian immigrant family named Hagen built a sod and metal cabin near Devil's Lake, North Dakota, in 1897. The father, Olaf, had seen metal shell construction on a railroad job in Montana and brought the idea back when the family claimed their homestead. The cabin was small, 16 by 20 feet, but it stayed livable through the winter of 1898, which was one of the coldest on record in the region. Temperatures dropped to 44 below in January. The Hagens burned 1 cord of wood per month and never let the interior temperature fall below 55 degrees. Their neighbors asked questions. Olaf showed them. By 1900, 7 families near Devil's Lake had built sod cabins with metal shells. The technique became part of the local building culture. When new families moved into the area, they were told about the metal shell before they were told where to buy supplies. It was just what you did if you wanted to stay warm without going broke on firewood. The military noticed by 1900. Fort Assiniboine in Montana, an active cavalry post, had chronic problems with frozen water lines and inadequate heating in the enlisted barracks. Winter 1900 to 1901 was particularly bad. Pipes froze. Men got frostbite sleeping in their bunks. Morale dropped. The post quartermaster, Captain Edwin Morris, had heard about the metal shell cabins from a civilian contractor and decided to test it. In the spring of 1901, Morris had metal shells built over 2 enlisted barracks. Standard corrugated roofing metal, 6-inch air gaps, sealed at the bottom with wood skirts. The work took 3 weeks and cost the Army $240 in materials and labor. That winter, those 2 barracks stayed 8 to 12 degrees warmer than the other barracks, used 30% less coal, and had 0 frozen pipes. Captain Morris wrote a report, sent it up the chain. The War Department reviewed it, consulted with engineers, and issued a bulletin in 1902 recommending metal shell or equivalent wind barrier construction for all new cold weather facilities. The bulletin wasn't mandatory, but it influenced design decisions at posts across the northern plains and Mountain West. By 1905, metal shells were standard at Fort Robinson in Nebraska, Fort Meade in South Dakota, and 3 posts in Montana. Back in the Flathead Valley, Raymond's original cabin had become something of a local landmark. People brought visitors to see it. The metal was weathering, surface rust, a few dents. But it was still solid, still functional, still keeping the place warm. Jonas Millwright brought apprentices by to show them what he'd learned. "This is what I got wrong," he'd say, pointing at the metal shell. "I thought metal would make it colder. I didn't understand wind." Kephart understood wind. Raymond never made money from the idea, never patented it, never charged for consultations, never wrote a manual. He just showed people who asked and let the technique spread on its own. By 1905, he estimated that at least 200 structures in Montana alone had some version of the metal shell. Probably more he didn't know about. The idea had moved beyond him, taken on a life of its own, become part of how people built in cold country. Catherine Kephart kept journals. In one entry from January 1904, she wrote, "Raymond's metal cabin is 16 years old now. Still tight, still warm. People still come to look at it like it's strange. but they go home and build their own. I think that's what Raymond wanted. Not credit, just to know it worked." End quote. The innovation peaked around 1910. By then, commercial insulation materials were becoming available: rock wool, corkboard, early fiberglass. These materials were expensive, but they were easier to install than a full metal shell and didn't require as much structural modification. Builders started using them in new construction, especially in towns where appearance mattered more than it did on a remote homestead. But in rural areas, in mining camps, in railroad section houses, the metal shell persisted through the teens and into the 20s. It was cheap. It was proven. It worked with materials you could buy at any hardware store or salvage from a warehouse. And for people who didn't care what their cabin looked like as long as it stayed warm, the metal shell was still the best option. The technique finally faded in the 1920s and 30s as rural electrification reached the northern territories, and as families moved away from wood heat toward coal, oil, and eventually electric heating. A metal shell didn't matter as much when you had a furnace that could overpower any heat loss. The innovation had solved a specific problem: how to stay warm in a drafty log cabin during a Montana winter when firewood was your only fuel. Once that problem became less common, the solution became less necessary. But the cabins remained. Some of them stayed occupied into the 40s and 50s. A few made it to the 60s. And in every case, the families who lived in those cabins said the same thing: warmest place they'd ever lived. Used less wood than anything else they'd tried. Looked ugly. But who cared when it was 20 below outside and 70 inside? Raymond Kephart's cabin was torn down in 1954. The property had been sold twice since Raymond and Catherine moved to Bozeman, and the new owners wanted to build a modern ranch house. They salvaged the metal panels, used them for a hay shed. The logs underneath were still solid, no rot, no insect damage, just old wood that had been protected from weather for 66 years. The man who dismantled the cabin told a reporter from the Livingston Enterprise that he'd never seen log construction hold up that well. Whatever that metal shell did, he said, it worked. Jonas Millwright's cabin lasted longer. It stayed in his family until 1968. His grandson, Martin, lived there until he was 30, then moved to Billings for work. The cabin sat empty for 6 years, then burned in a grass fire in 1974. But for 85 years, that cabin had stayed warm, stayed dry, and proved that Jonas had been wrong and Raymond had been right. Hit like if you appreciate stories about people who trusted the evidence over their assumptions. The final accounting, done by a graduate student from Montana State University in 1983, estimated that approximately 400 structures in Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas had used metal shell construction between 1888 and 1930. Most were residential cabins. Some were bunkhouses, storage sheds, small barns. A handful were public buildings, schoolhouses, meeting halls, one church in Chinook, Montana, that kept the metal shell until it was demolished in 1961. The fuel savings were substantial. A standard log cabin in Montana in the 1890s burned 4 to 6 cords of wood per winter. A metal shell cabin burned 2 to 3 cords. Over the course of 20 years, the rough lifespan of the technique's popularity, those 400 structures saved an estimated 16,000 cords of wood. That's wood that didn't have to be cut, split, hauled, and burned. That's labor saved, money saved, forests left standing. And it came from one man watching railroad workers bolt together metal huts and asking himself if that same principle could keep his family from freezing. That's the lesson. Not that metal shells are a universal solution, they're not. Not that old techniques are always better, they're not. But that observation matters. That asking, why does that work, and could it work here, can lead to answers nobody else has found. Raymond wasn't an engineer, wasn't a scientist. He was a railroad worker who paid attention and thought about what he saw. That was enough. The University of Montana's Western Historical Quarterly published an article about frontier thermal engineering in 1991. It included 3 paragraphs about metal shell construction, citing Raymond Kephart's cabin as the likely origin point. The article noted that the technique demonstrated practical understanding of convective heat loss and the insulating properties of dead air space, and that it anticipated modern ventilated facade systems by nearly a century. The article didn't make Raymond famous. He'd been dead for 64 years by then. But it put the innovation into the historical record, preserved the details, made sure the story wouldn't be completely forgotten. That matters. Not because Raymond needs recognition, he doesn't. He's gone. But because the principle still works. Wind still steals heat. Still air still insulates. The physics haven't changed. And somewhere, sometime, someone might need to solve the same problem Raymond solved. How to stay warm in a cold place with limited fuel. If that person finds the historical record, finds the story of the metal shell cabin, they'll have a solution that's been tested by winter and proven by 70 years of use. That's why history matters, not for nostalgia, for solutions. The end.